So, when you think about old Hollywood, what first pops into your head? Is it, the silent movie stars, the glamour, or maybe that huge moment when movies suddenly got sound? Okay, yeah, let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into a film that, well, it literally changed Hollywood. It kicked off the whole sound era. The Jazz Singer, from back in 1927. I mean, this film is pretty much always cited as the one that proved sound movies could actually make money, be a huge success. We even saw sources mentioning how ABC News, way later in 1977, said it revolutionized the film industry. But, and this is the big but, right? While it was this amazing technical leap, it's also, well, it's deeply troubling to watch now. Morally problematic, you could say. Mostly because of the blackface. So our mission today is kind of figure out this split. How can one film be so important for movie history and so ethically difficult? And what does that tell us about where Hollywood came from and maybe where it's still going? We've got a good stack of articles, lots of research to help us walk through this. It's complicated. If you've seen Singing in the Rain, that movie does a great job showing how chaotic and, frankly, funny that switch from silent films to talkies was.
Right. It depicts the transition.
Exactly. But The Jazz Singer, it wasn't just showing the transition. It was the transition. It was the proof sound could work commercially.
Yeah.
A total game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. But what's interesting, though, is that even with that huge technical shift, some of the sources we looked at argue the actual story in The Jazz Singer is, well, cliched and unoriginal.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Basically, it's about Jakey Rabinowitz, that's Al Jolson's character who wants to be a jazz singer, but his dad's a cantor, very devout, wants him to follow Jewish tradition. So Jakey leaves, changes his name to Jack Robin, gets famous, and then has to kind of juggle his background in this new American dream. But the sources suggest the film tackles this huge conflict, well, in a superficial rather than a meaningful way.
So technically groundbreaking, but maybe not so much in the story department.
Exactly. That's the paradox.
Okay, so let's get into the part that's really tough for us watching today. The blackface. The main character putting on black makeup to go on stage. It's hard to watch.
It is, and we need to understand what blackface actually was. Basically, it's wearing dark makeup to caricature, often mock people of African descent. Its roots are in this really racist form of entertainment called minstrelsy that started in the U.S. early 19th century. You had white performers painting their faces and acting out these derogatory, stereotyped caricatures of black people.
Stereotypes painting them as lazy or foolish.
Yeah.
Really harmful stuff.
Exactly. And it was unbelievably a hugely popular American entertainment form. Crucially, it was designed for white audiences. This was way before movies even picked it up. Now, some people might try to argue, oh, it was just the norm back then, trying to excuse it in The Jazz Singer.
Right. A reflection of its time.
But our sources push back on that. They argue that the fact these scenes were even filmed and accepted, well, it reveals just how little respect Hollywood had for black people then.
And, digging through the research, what really jumped out was finding examples of this not being that long ago. Sources mentioned people like Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, using blackface more recently. It kind of brings it home that this isn't just some ancient history from the 1920s we can easily dismiss.
No, it's definitely not. And you see the impact today. The Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, really sparked what sources call a wave of reckoning and regret over blackface.
Right, like shows being pulled or getting disclaimers added.
Exactly. Content being removed, warnings added. It shows a real shift in how we're confronting these things now, societally. But here's where it gets even more complex, maybe even contradictory. Some of the historical perspectives we found are, well, they're quite something.
Oh.
What's fascinating is some sources suggest Al Jolson himself may have considered the use of blackface a progressive act.
Progressive? How?
Well, some scholars interpret it this way. They argue that for certain performers, especially Jewish entertainers at that time, blackface was a tool for transitioning from immigrant Jewish identity into American identity, even suggesting blackface was a pathway to whiteness.
Wow. Okay, that needs some unpacking.
Yeah, you have to remember the context. Jewish immigrants faced a lot of discrimination. They were systematically excluded from many American industries, much like Black Americans and other marginalized groups were.
So the idea is, it was a way to fit in or gain acceptance in a hostile environment.
That's the argument some sources present. Like, as a Jewish immigrant trying to survive, you might feel forced to make that choice. But, and this is critical, they immediately follow up. But ultimately, those decisions have long-term consequences, especially for Black people, both in the industry and on screen.
So even if there was that perceived motivation for some performers, it came at a huge cost to Black people.
Precisely. And it raises questions about the character Jack in the film, too. Sources suggest he may mistakenly believe that blackface enables him to tap into qualities he perceives as inherently Black.
Like it gives him access to something.
Sort of. There's a moment when he looks in the mirror in blackface, and he apparently feels this emotional connection he didn't have before.
Which is ironic, because another point the sources brought up is that despite the title, The Jazz Singer, there isn't a single true jazz song in the entire film.
Right. The music he performs isn't really jazz. Not the jazz of that era, anyway.
So the critical take we found is that blackface gives Jack access to the so-called emotional intensity and musicality associated with Blackness. But crucially, Black people are the ones who pay the price for such stereotypes.
Yeah, it feeds into harmful stereotypes while seeming to offer the performer some kind of expressive freedom. It's a really problematic dynamic. And zooming out, the jazz singer story isn't, just a one-off weird thing. It really shows how the whole entertainment industry's history is far more deeply entangled with blackface than many assume. It points to something systemic right from the start in Hollywood.
Yeah, and it's not the only example, is it? The sources mention other huge films once seen as milestones, markers of cultural progress that we now view as, well, shameful relics, or even overtly racist propaganda.
Like Birth of a Nation.
Yeah. Exactly. The Birth of a Nation from 1915. Technically brilliant for its time, right?
Yeah.
D.W. Griffith's techniques basically invented a lot of classical Hollywood style. Broke box office records.
Hugely influential.
But it's also a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. Just deeply, deeply repugnant. And sources say Griffith's style didn't just influence filmmaking, it also shaped modern media's representation of these groups. Harmfully.
And then there's Gone with the Wind. Still makes incredible amounts of money, adjusted for inflation, but it's absolutely notorious for its racist portrayals. Still debated constantly.
Right.
And this really connects to today. What the sources argue is that racist images on screen can easily spill into harmful behavior and violence off screen. People are, thankfully, starting to realize this more and more.
There's this analogy in the sources describing it like a poisonous tree. The argument is, if the root is racism, the fruit born from that poisonous tree will also be racism. And they draw a line from that early stuff straight through to things like white savior tropes in much later films. They even mention The Help from 2011 as an example.
Where a white character kind of swoops in to save the day for people of color, often sidestepping the deeper systemic problems.
Exactly.
It all feeds into this larger argument that the entertainment industry fundamentally was built upon a mindset that centers white supremacy. An industry where, historically, Black people were always the butt of the joke, designed almost to satisfy a perverse need to normalize power imbalances.
So, okay, we've laid out this really complex history. What does this all mean for you, listening now?
Yeah.
For the modern viewer, how do we even watch something like The Jazz Singer today?
Well, the sources really stress the importance of critical engagement, understanding both its place in film history, its artistic significance, and its negative historical impact, especially on marginalized communities. It's essential, really.
So you can acknowledge the technical achievement, the first talkie aspect.
Absolutely. But you have to, at the same time, acknowledge the harm it perpetuated through those stereotypes. You can't just ignore the blackface.
Yeah. It feels like The Jazz Singer almost serves as a warning sign, doesn't it? A reminder of these darker parts of Hollywood's past and how that past might still, cast a shadow on films today.
Definitely. And if Hollywood genuinely wants lasting and meaningful change, as the sources put it, the suggestions are pretty clear. It needs increased representation across all sectors of the industry.
Not just actors, but behind the camera, in agencies.
Right, including talent agencies, and also developing accessible career pipelines that lead to valued professional skills. Basically opening the doors properly.
And it feels like it's part of a bigger shift in society, too, right? The sources mention making space for more diverse voices, different stories, letting people express themselves freely.
Yeah, and they frame it not just ethically, but also practically. Society is changing not just in the U.S., but globally, and it's a good thing for businesses to adapt to that.
Makes sense. So as we wrap up, maybe the big question to leave you with is something we've been circling around. When we look back at The Jazz Singer, or maybe even newer films, can art, can technical innovation ever really make up for its moral failings?
That's a core tension.
And how do we make sure that the progress we think we're making now doesn't just end up creating a different kind of exclusion, maybe a more subtle kind of blackface for today. Something to think about. We definitely encourage you to keep digging yourselves, maybe rewatch some classics with this critical eye, or look into the history behind other films that shaped how we see the world.